Hi, I'm Carrie.
And I'm Molly.
And you're listening to the
Two Sisters on Adventures podcast,
the Wonderland Trail edition. So if you remember last podcast episode, we had fallen asleep in our very cold and wet campsite. And you might imagine, what a nice, relaxing sleep a person probably gets when, you've been so cold and then you've gotten into your warm tent. But that would probably be for a person who didn't, as soon as they got in their tents, start hearing screaming.
Yeah, it was crazy. First of all, we were very cold and I was laying there. And I think the issue is with any type of a sleep system, a down sleep system, it's requisite on your body heat warming you up. So we were already so cold from hiking in the rain and then shivering on the porch while we were eating our smushy sub sandwiches. And so when we were finally in our tent in our sleeping quilts, we were just laying there, pretty cold, a little miserable, touch of misery. And I'm laying there and I hear this piercing scream and I'm just like, oh no. I didn't even think it was a person really. I thought it was like maybe a cougar or something. And I was like, ugh, like here we're freezing and now we're going to be eaten alive by a cougar. Like, why are we even out here? And then it happened again. And it happened every maybe like 5 or 10 minutes. And finally, one time there was like a little bit of a bugling sound associated with it. And I realized that it was elk. And I don't remember, did I say that to you then, Carrie?
I feel like you might have said elk or something like that. I don't know. It was so weird because I feel like the first few just sounded like exclusively like a scream. And honestly, I feel like I've seen videos of elk bugling before and it's kind of funny, right? Because they look so majestic and then they're like, basically. But at the end, they kind of do like a, and you're like, oh, okay. Because I feel like the first couple that I heard, I was like, I thought it was a person the first time. And I was just trying to think like, oh man, like I don't even know what you're supposed to do if you just hear someone screaming at a campsite. And then the second time it happened, I think I heard a little bit of the weird thing at the end where I was like, I think it's an animal, but I couldn't figure out what it was because I just wasn't even considering elk for some reason. But yeah, we got to listen to a night of, those elks, those handsome elks trying to find their ladies and it was loud. It was loud bugling.
And it was crazy because, like, the first time we heard it, it sounded like they were over closer to the lake that was, like, by where the cabin was. And then as the night went on, you could, like, hear them going from, like, east to west until when it was morning, their bugling was from, like, the opposite direction that it was earlier. So they were traveling along as they were doing their bugling, and it was just another thing to keep a person up during the night where you're a little cold and wet and miserable already. But when we woke up, I did say to Rachel, like, hey, did you hear the elk? And she was like, oh, I had no idea what that was. So all night long she was, I don't know if she thought it was a person or what. I guess we should have asked her.
Hopefully not.
But so she had to deal with hearing that without thinking about it being an elk. But I don't really think I slept too much that night. I feel like it was just one of those awake nights in the tent, which happens every now and then, and that's okay. And then it was, I think it really hadn't rained all night. It had been that downpour when we set up our tents. And then it had just been like super cloudy and foggy and kind of cold, super humid. But we actually had the dripping of the tree on our tent all night long because, of course, the pro of pitching a tent under a tree is that when it's raining, you don't get the torrential downpour on your tent, but then you have now reserved the ability to have water dripping on your tent for hours, or it feels like it could even be days. So we got to listen to that all night long, and then in the morning, it was still kind of cold, but you could tell it was warming up a little bit, but we didn't have any motivation to get out of bed. This next day, day 2, we were going to walk from Golden Lakes to Klapatche Park, and we only had to do 8 miles, which is like a luxurious distance for us. So it wasn't like we needed to get an early start necessarily, and everything we had was soaking wet. Like we had to change in the tent the night before, obviously, and we just threw all of our clothes like at the bottom of the tent, so we had like just everything that was soaking wet. I didn't even know what to do with my rain gear when I was getting in the night before because it was soaking wet and I didn't have a place for it. And I feel ashamed of this, but I actually just laid my soaking wet rain gear in the mud outside of our tent because like under the vestibule because I didn't know where to put it. And there was just minimal to no motivation to even put on our clothes because once again we have that one pair of essential items, shorts, like hiking hoodie, bra, all these things, and I brought 2 pairs of hiking socks, and I knew that my shoes were soaking, and so I was gonna have to put on soaking wet socks because I'm not gonna get my dry socks wet by putting them into wet shoes. And so I think it was like 9 a.m. and we were still in our tents, and Carrie was like, you know what, Molly, I think it might be a little bit sunny outside.
Yeah, and of course, I'm not that much of an optimist, but when I can see that it is becoming light and the air around me is becoming warmer, I'm like, you know what? I think it's going to be sunny out. And Molly was like, absolutely not. There's no way there's going to be any sun.
I was like, no, it's definitely foggy, Carrie. It's definitely going to be totally socked in out there. We're not going to see the sun. There won't be any blue sky. We won't be able to dry out.
And I feel like probably around like 9:15, I was like, well, just open the tent and let's see, is there sun or is it exclusively fog?
And I don't have to open the tent for Carrie typically. However, in the way we had pitched our tent, her rainfly was like over the root of a tree and far out of reach. So she had no ability to unzip her side. So I did reach and unzip, and sure enough, it was blue sky directly overhead. And I was just like, Rachel, Carrie, we've got blue sky.
Which I will say, if there was one miracle of that day, it was that I did not have to go poop yet. Like normally I got to rocket out of the tent in the morning, but that morning, luckily I was able to just lay there till 9:30 a.m. Must be this trail subway is just, keeping me fine. So
it's the yoga mat bread.
And that was especially fortunate because my shoes, I think, were on your side, so I would have had to climb over you. But yeah, the sun was out.
Plus your vestibule, like it wasn't even a functional door at that point, so it was all messed up.
Yeah, everything was like pretty weird. But you know what? The sun was shining and we were going to have a good day. So we finally were able to get out of the tent, and honestly, it just felt good to feel the sun. Like, of course, we were in a shady area because there were trees all around, but there were a couple of patches of sun. So, you start putting your shoes in those and just kind of making yourself come to life, even though it is already 9:30 in the morning. And it's kind of funny because, like, the place where we had not pitched our tent, the ground had already absorbed that massive pool of water. It was just like it had rained so hard that night that everything had just been kind of screwed up. But we got out of our tents and we went and we got our bear bags off, or like our food bags off of the bear poles. And there was a little bit of sun touching that bear pole. So we actually just decided, since everyone else had, of course, already left camp, including, we were most impressed by that Wisconsin guy and his group of friends because they left at 5:30 in the morning, which I'm like, they probably had to because they probably had a 20-mile day. But I really respect people who are like, going to bed freezing cold and wet, getting up freezing cold and wet, and just going when it's still cold out. Good for them. And I think we could have done that if we would have had to, but we really didn't have to. It was an 8-mile day. We were lounging.
We were
straight up lounging. So yeah,
I was struck with a moment of genius when I was like, you know what? If no one is using this bear pole, we will use this bear pole. So I started grabbing all of our clothes, and I remember my my rain pants when I used the like special little implement to like lift them up and put them on the hook. Water just came pouring out of them. Like everything was so waterlogged. And so we fit like all of our clothes and Rachel's clothes on the bear pole, which questionable how successful it actually was, because then I think all the wet clothes were just touching each other. So but at least it made me feel hopeful when I put them all on there that I wouldn't have to wear wet clothes forever, because once again there's this weird thing that happens when you're hiking in the rain and it's cold and you're soaking wet. You just feel like you're never gonna get dry. But it was really a blessing that we already were dealing with some blue skies and some sunshine, and it took a while for the sun to actually reach where we were pitching our tents because we were just in an area that was pretty treed. But once we actually could feel like a little bit of the rays of the sun, that felt good too. And so a mood booster for this morning was that the pumpkin sheet cake that we had not eaten the night before, we got to have for breakfast. And what did you think about that, Carrie?
Oh, 10 out of 10 breakfast. Probably better than anything you could ever bring for breakfast in terms of flavor, density of cake, weight. It was very light for me because Molly carried it all. And so that was a real mood booster. Now, a real mood downer was when I looked in my pack and I found, so usually I'm very careful when I get in, like put everything in my bear bag at night. I just try to make sure, right, there's no wrappers, nothing that could attract a bear or a mouse or anything. Well, because we'd been like frantic to get in our tents that night, I had left one single bag in my pocket of my pack.
And it was a Ziploc bag that we used.
And it was empty, but it had a granola bar, like it had housed previously a homemade granola bar. And the mouse had chewed a hole into the pocket of my pack, gone in, not found any food in there, but it did make sure to poop like 40 times in my pocket. And of course, not only did it poop in my pocket, it pooped in my extra lid that I have for my smart water bottle so that I can switch between my straw and a lid. And it also made sure to poop in the lid that we were going to use as part of our backwashing system. You can, instead of bringing the syringe that the Sawyer Squeeze comes with, you can use like a sport cap to backwash. And obviously, I'm not going to use the mouse poop lid to backwash my water filter. So that was kind of devastating because immediately, like day one, I didn't bring the syringe because it's bigger and bulkier. So day one, we already could not backwash our filter because the mouse had pooped in it so many times. So I feel like I handled it pretty well, to be honest. Like I really could have flipped out, but I did say probably about 40 times how bummed out I was about the fact that a mouse had pooped so many times in my pocket. And I felt like I couldn't even use it anymore because it was kind of gross. And there was also a hole in it, which I need to remember so I can repair it. Yeah. I feel like we got home and we washed our packs, and I don't know why I didn't even think about like, hey, I need to sew up that hole. So anyway, real life, don't ever leave anything in your pockets. / on the Wonderland Trail, the mice are literally insane. You'll hear some more of our experiences with them on trail. But we've also heard from other people who went who said that they saw like rats trying to climb up the bear poles. So just be aware that these are campsites that are quite frequently used. And so obviously I'd say like little wildlife gets habituated like big wildlife does. So that's just an aside. Other than that, spirits were high because the sun was shining and we were going to go on a beautiful little hike today.
And we had pumpkin cake. So how can you beat that? So yeah, we finally, it was approaching noon. And we finally got all of our clothes off of the bear pole and kind of, got ourselves situated. And then I can still remember we had packed up our tents and everything. The last thing we had to do was put on our soaking wet socks. And it takes a special amount of just self-discipline to slide those soaking wet socks on and then put on your soaking wet trail runners. And we hit the trail at about 12:30 p.m., which I would say is potentially a record for the latest start we've ever had from camp. And if it's not a record, it's darn close to a record. So I remember the first couple steps I took, or maybe the first mile or so. If I wiggled my toes, it was like little puddles in my shoes that were just slopping around in there. But yeah, so we hit the trail and there were a couple of clouds floating around in the sky, but we had sun and we had blue skies. And for some reason, I was thinking that we were going to go downhill right away, but I think we started with a bit of an uphill, like a reasonable grade, enough to get your blood pumping and kind of warm up your body. And then we were kind of on a ridge area. We kind of rounded a corner, and this was a super beautiful area because we really got to see some of the famous fall colors that we were hoping to see in Washington.
Yeah, this was so exciting because I feel like my true dream for this, I've always wanted to do a true Washington fall backpacking trip because there's so many vines and there will be maple trees and all these beautiful colors. And I just wanted to do the Wonderland Trail and experience Mount Rainier plus all of those beautiful fall colors. And you can't really, you can try and plan and hopefully be there when that happens. But I feel like in Klapatche, or sorry, not in Klapatche, in Golden Lakes, there were like some pretty kind of, I feel like the grass there kind of gets golden-y, you know, so it was pretty. And it was a beautiful like camping area. The lakes were super pretty in the morning with like the mist rising off of them. But I wouldn't say that we'd seen anything that was like too intense in terms of fall colors. But it was like we kind of rounded this corner and there was this little meadow with the trail very artistically zigzagging through it, like just meandering. And, you know, you have the little bit of the like green, evergreen type of trees in the background as well. And it was just so pretty. I just got so excited because it kind of felt like, okay, the timing actually is perfect this year, and what a blessing. And it was kind of neat because this area that we were walking through was actually a burn scar from the 1930s. And I wouldn't have known that except for on the Far Out app. It said like 1930s burn scar. And I was like, that's such an interesting piece of information to see, because I think sometimes we feel like, you know, forest fires that happen now, we're like, well, how is this going to recover? What it'll look like in 100 years? And obviously those are on a larger scale, but it was interesting because this area had become treed again, but I'm going to assume not in any way near the capacity it had previously been treed before the fire. And I will say it was like a teeny bit nice to have some open areas there because, again, the ridge was so pretty with the fall colors. But also, this was one of the few little peekaboo views we got of Mount Rainier that day, just because it was kind of cloudy.
Like the mountain was kind of socked in. Yeah. Like there weren't clouds really outside of the fact that there were clouds on the mountain.
Yeah, it kind of had almost like a little just like veil going on. Yeah. And someone was like, Mount Rainier can be very shy this time of year. And I was like, yeah, she kind of just is like peeking out her head a little bit. But it was such a pretty area to see not only Mount Rainier, but also all the fall colors.
And I'm going to reminisce for a second about when Carrie talks about it's hard to plan things in Washington in the fall. So one of the first times we tried to plan something in the fall in Washington, we got a permit to climb Mount St. Helens for like October 2nd. And it was going to be so fun. And we were so excited. And then we took work off for it and everything. And when it rolled around, I think that Mount St. Helens was in the middle of getting a foot of snow. So we clearly didn't do that. And then another time, it was before I think we'd been to the North Cascades. We really wanted to get up there. We wanted to do a fall hike. And the one weekend that it would work for us, I think it was also snowing. So and I think that was also like early October, late September, actually. So that just kind of goes to show that, the timing is everything. And for this moment when we're walking in this beautiful area with the red like huckleberries and just like perfect blue sky, sunshine, we just felt like we kind of hit the nature's jackpot.
And one thing that was fun then was as we were starting to descend, so we were looking for blueberries this whole time, or like huckleberries, because I had read this blog a couple years ago about someone who did, a hike sort of similar to this at a similar time of year. And they were talking about how it was so fun to eat them frozen off of the plants as they were like changing colors. We did not find any huckleberries, but it was interesting because as we were walking along, there were these they looked similar to huckleberries, but they were kind of, they were a little bit more oblong in shape, and they had kind of like a pointiness to the end of them. So we didn't eat them because we couldn't tell if they were berries that were good to eat or not. And we did ask a ranger that we saw later if we could eat them or not. And they said that there's no poisonous berries at Mount Rainier, which I don't know. I feel like I would have to double check that research. Not that I don't trust a ranger, but I'm like, I don't know. Anyway, we tried them later, and spoiler alert, they were nasty. So if you try a huckleberry or what you think is a huckleberry and it tastes terrible, it might just be one of those weird berries.
Yeah, they called it a blueberry. It was interesting. But yeah, so I don't feel like there was anything too crazy. We basically descended for, several miles, and then you could hear the river. And so this was, I think, the North Puyallup at this point. So we kind of traveled along the river, and then this was a cool area because there was a really scenic bridge for us to cross. There was, I believe the water was really nice, kind of white, kind of colored like a glacial flow. And then there was a waterfall right next to the bridge. So when we were crossing over the bridge, you could admire that. And we met two guys who I think were finishing up a rest break. So we just said hi to them. And it was like ironic because we were a little bit spaced out. I think maybe Carrie was in the lead, Rachel in the middle, and I was in the back. And so when Carrie got to the guys, they were like, oh, sorry for being in your way, because he was like kind of sitting on the trail. Carrie's like, oh, that's fine. She passed him. And then he like set his stuff back on the trail. And then at that point, Rachel arrived and he was like, oh, I'm sorry, and like moved his stuff. And then she continued on, and then I got there, and it was funny because when I got there, I didn't know about the other people, but he was like, oh, I'm so sorry, like moved his stuff. And I was like, oh, it's fine. And I told Carrie, I was like, oh yeah, he like put his stuff on the trail and he apologized. And she's like, yeah, I think he did that for every single one of us. I should have just told him that there were 2 more people behind me. But we decided that because we were going to be ascending for the rest of the day at this point, we should probably have our lunch break. So it was a really nice lunch spot just because we had like the beautiful strong flow of the river to admire and the waterfall. And then this is where we tried our trail tamales.
Mm-hmm. So I had posted something on Instagram a while back asking what people do for their lunches on trail, because you know us, we've done tuna for years, and then this kind of has been a year where tuna does not sit as well with me. I'm not interested really in eating it on trail anymore. And we've been doing trail pizzas, which are great, but they're also kind of a little bit heavier, and you have to bring a few more ingredients. Somebody suggested walking tamales, and I have to say they are 10 out of 10 to me. You can buy them on Amazon, and I've got the spicy habanero because I love spice. And they have the texture of a tamale, which at first can be like slightly off-putting because you're, getting it out of just this little like packet. And I feel like sometimes it's just like a texture of tamale coming out of a packet feels weird versus like when it's warmed up coming out of a, corn husk. But it tastes so good. And this was something where I think that the first day we had it, we were a little bit like, kind of weird because it's like a strange texture for the trail. But then every day, like if it wasn't what we had for lunch, we felt a little sad because it was so good and so flavorful. So Philos, walking tamales, I would definitely recommend as a lunch on trail right now. It's actually got like 260 calories for 4 ounces, which is not the best ratio, but
it also is something that I really, really want to eat. So that is great for me. And it was actually good enough. I even wrote in my journal 2 thumbs up. And I would agree with Carrie that the texture with the first one I ate, I was like, wow, that's a little different, but the flavor was so good. And we paired it with Fritos. So then that was even better. But then when I ate one the next time, it was like everything was perfect about it. I loved the texture. And then I was just craving it basically the rest of the trip. I think Carrie even had a cookies and cream bar for her candy item that day. So she got to eat that along with our lunch. And then we probably took a good 30 minutes to rest. And then we figured we better set out because we had left at noon. So you can't sit around too much when the sun is going down at 7 p.m. So we hit the trail. And shortly after we left, I guess we filled up our water and everything there too. There was a nice flow of water that was not glacial that we could access easily. So we topped off and then hit the trail, and shortly thereafter met a group of people who were descending from Klapatche Park. And they made sure to tell us that we had a hard climb ahead. And I don't know, Carrie and I, for years, I think we just question when people say those things to a person who's going uphill.
I think my personal thing is, unless there's like something that presents physical and imminent danger to a person, you don't necessarily need to just set someone up for having negative thoughts in their head. Like, I mean, honestly, we discussed this later, and I think their descent was probably worse than our climb because it was just one of those rocky ones.
There was a lot of steep sections too,
where I don't think you could find a good rhythm for going downhill because you have to be so cautious with your footing. Going uphill, of course, it was hard. I feel like it's always going to be challenging going uphill because it's like you're a little bit more aerobically involved, and it was sort of a long ascent, but it wasn't even going to be the longest ascent that we were going to have on trail. And so I don't know, I just always get so annoyed when, like, okay, it's fine if one person wants to say, wow, you got a really rough climb ahead. It's kind of like, okay, but then when you meet someone every like 15 minutes and they're like, whoa, wouldn't want to be doing this climb if I were you. It's like, okay, well, guess what? I actually want to be out here. That's why I'm here,
And I also have roughly 80 miles till I can get to my car, so I have no choice.
And I feel like after like the 5th or 6th person, I started getting a little sassy where and maybe that's not right, I guess, but where they'd be like, whoa, tough climb. it's really, a lot of uphill. And I'd be like, well, if this trail was all downhill, I guess we'd be in the center of the earth. I think I actually said that to someone. I was like, and I wouldn't want to be there because it'd be getting terribly hot. So I guess I'd rather go up and down. But it's like, I think it's just one of those things where like, if someone wanted to say like, hey, there's like rock fall, so watch out up ahead, which there wasn't, you know what I mean? But like that kind of stuff is actually like informational versus just being like, ugh, steep climb, sucks to be you, bro. I'm like, that's not helpful. I just feel like I prefer to try to help lift others up. And even if I think in my mind, like, steep climb, I'll be like, oh, the fall colors are so pretty.
Or honestly, I just resorted to, yep, it seems like that's what this trail is, going up and down. And so it's just I don't know, like maybe we're too nitpicky. But it's like this vibe of being on the trail, right? We want to lift people up. We want to keep it positive. And if there's something like that is a safety concern, definitely we want to let people know. But it's just interesting how a person who's maybe not enjoying the descent that they're experiencing, which Carrie and I would both agree, it seems like the descent from Klapatche, if a person is going clockwise, would be a challenging descent. But sometimes not making negative comments is probably a better plan, because why make someone else's day negative too? Like, so it's funny because we finally we're like, Rachel, are you late? Is this a little off? And she was like, yeah, I don't know why everyone is saying this. And in reality, Carrie, she was setting the pace for us on a lot of our uphills on this trip. And she found the most perfect uphill gear. And we just had a wonderful climb up to the top. And once again, it was challenging because it's uphill, but it was a really nice uphill for us. And I don't know.
And ultimately, to me, I always think like these are only a few minutes in the grand scheme of my life, So like, of course you're allowed to feel tired or annoyed by an uphill. Like sometimes I'm like, when's the uphill over, Or you're allowed to be annoyed by a downhill. But sometimes I just like put it in context of my entire life. And I'm like, okay, so for like 30 minutes, I did an unpleasant uphill. And now I'm 30 years old. So that like, what is that in the context of my life? That's nothing, And so I think that, yeah, one thing that we can all probably work on as a whole, maybe I don't need to be sassy to people on trails when they tell me that it's going to be hard for me to go uphill, but also maybe they don't need to tell me that. But anyway,
but you could just say, no, it's not.
Yeah, I guess I could be like, what a fun, easy hill. But I just think like in the outdoor community, it's just so awesome whenever you meet someone and they're like, wow, like either just like, wow, you're killing it, or what a beautiful day, or like, how lucky are we to be out here? Because Klapatche is a very desirable camp. Like we were going uphill, yes, and the climb was climbing, but we were going to a campsite that people wish they could get on their itinerary. And so I think it's kind of just like in backpacking and hiking, you can choose, and life, I guess, you can choose to see the negatives of like, ugh, this is a terrible climb, I wish I was going downhill. Or you can see the positives of like, it's not raining today, it's not snowing 10 inches, and I actually get to do this trail and the fall colors are popping.
And I'll even give some kudos with another sidebar just to generally like the outdoor community. I remember when Carrie and I first started attending a bouldering gym with some friends who were climbers. We were like actually blown away by how positive that climbing culture was. And this is years ago. And I don't know if sometimes organized sports lack that positive culture, because we had played, like basketball, volleyball, but I don't think I'd ever been in an environment where everyone was so uplifting, just being like, you can do this, like you're gonna do well, and just really contributing to a positive mindset. And so I just feel like that's such a special thing that we can encourage in others. And so we just really had to kind of snicker to ourselves as we went uphill after having many, many warnings about how bad it was going to be and how it was fine. And I'm thankful, because at one point that might have totally ruined not my day, but at least the next couple hours that I was walking uphill, because I still place too much value on what people tell me on trail and allow it to get into my head. But I was glad that that wasn't the case for this climb.
We actually made great time to Klapatche. We got there around 5 p.m., which that's great time. 4.5 hours of hiking. And you know what? We've just reinforced our bad camp leaving behavior, because we left at 12:30 and the consequence was that we got to camp at an amazing time.
I think we were the second people to get to the camp that day.
Yeah. So that was kind of awesome. We had our pick of all the campsites. And we actually decided to camp in one that I would say would be the most scenic campsite at Klapatche and probably one of our most scenic camps on the entire trail. And we kind of went back and forth because it was a very open campsite and it was a little bit more exposed. There was no tree cover. And we
Although there were trees around it, but there weren't trees directly over us.
But we kind of went back and forth because it was supposed to rain that night. We knew the forecast. And so we were like, there's obviously a pro to being underneath a tree when there's a downpour happening. But the con that we had reinforced the night before was you get to listen to like pop, 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 pop for like 7 hours while the trees drip rain on you.
And then your tent loses out on an opportunity to dry because you're being continuously pop, 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 pop on by the tree.
So we kind of weighed the pros and the cons and we said, actually it was awesome because Rachel was there so she can make the decision for us.
Because Carrie and I were just waffling between what we should do.
And I think we were kind of leaning towards the more scenic campsite, but then we were like, is that it just because we want it because it's scenic? And Rachel was like, no, let's just camp here. Ended up being a great decision, honestly. And so I think, I don't know, I just am like, probably in the future I'll gravitate a little bit more towards sites where there's not tree cover. I suppose if I know that the rain's supposed to just be continuous for days, it'd be a different thing. But we knew it was
maybe hail, I guess.
Yeah, well, yeah, maybe. But at that point, we decided to camp there, and it was so fun because then when we set up our tents and had all our stuff laying around trying to dry, we could, kind of look at the mountain, which was partially covered by a cloud, but it was still so pretty. And one of the really fun parts of this trail is you're kind of up close and personal with glaciers and seeing how like they transition from one to the next. And I feel like the cloud was covering most of the glaciers, but there were some kind of popping out at the bottom and they were just really beautiful to see. So we set up camp, and one thing that was a little bit funny about that campsite was it was super windy. And so we had like all of our clothes like laid out, and then the wind would come and like blow them. And you'd be like, Rachel, grab my rain jacket. Molly, can you like grab, this other thing? And so nothing actually ever did blow away, but it was like this funny thing because there would be no wind. So you'd have everything laid out and then there'd be like gusts, gusts, gusts. And it was a very cold campsite, honestly. But
I think it was just a cold evening.
Yeah. We thought we were going to be all alone. So we were kind of all just huddled on our little log, eating our dinner and the last of our cake. And me, of course, dipping into the next day's snacks because everything looks so good. Like the worst thing ever is having to wait to rehydrate your food because then you just start dipping into the next day's snacks. At least I do. So we saw these two girls walking on the trail and we were like, oh, that's crazy. There's other people that are going to be here tonight.
And they were in like a great mood, like laughing and everything.
Yeah, they were just having a great time. And it turned out that they were actually rangers. Yeah. They had come up there to, spend the night, check on the toilet, make sure everybody had permits. So they checked our permit and we visited with them for kind of a little while. And they were just like so nice and such a great mood. And
I was so surprised. I know they were probably hiking uphill to get there, but one of them was wearing a short sleeve shirt as I'm wearing like almost all the layers that I have as I'm like huddling on this log eating. And here she walks up in a short sleeve shirt, and the ranger was super nice because she had the most recent forecast on her phone, which obviously we looked at the forecast 2 days before, but we'd already been out. This is now going to be our second night. And so she even offered to airdrop like the most recent forecast, which I thought was super cool. Yeah. And so then it was kind of funny because a couple other groups actually did trickle in after us. And I feel like I just assumed we would be the last people of the day because of our late start. But it is a very desirable campsite. And so there were some other people there. I don't know if they were doing the whole trail or not. But honestly, the campsites were far enough away that it felt very quiet. And I will say one thing I remember before we got into our tents was we all go to use the bathroom one last time, of course. And it was so cool because Molly was like, Carrie, come look at this. And Klapatche Park is kind of up high on a ridge, and below you could see far away, like the lights we think of Tacoma. And it looked so beautiful. And we've never really been on a mountain at night that's that near to a big city. So it was kind of a more unique view to have. The only thing I could compare it to was we stayed overnight at Broken Top one night, which is close to the city of Bend, Oregon, and we could see that. But it was a totally different experience being on that ridge, on that mountain that feels so isolated and far away from everything. And then seeing like the huge city of Tacoma, probably up into even Seattle, spread out. And
Obviously, it wasn't in the valley below us, but it feels like it is because it feels like you're on the edge of the world.
Yeah.
So after we'd had our toilet time, we did what Molly said we should do to warm up before bed.
And this is something that I actually learned. I think it was on a video on like Instagram from Enlightened Equipment, or maybe Carrie and I, we actually, maybe Andrew Skirka, or maybe I was sent this when I bought a quilt from Enlightened Equipment. But anyways, it said that you should try to increase your body temperature before getting into your sleep system. So whether that's running in place, doing jumping jacks, whatever it is, all of a sudden we're all outside of our respective tents and we're doing cardio.
Yeah, there was jumping jacks, running in place, reverse lunges, and honestly, it was like a pretty good time. And I do think it made a difference in making me warmer. So I kind of wish I had done it the night before. But yeah, we all climbed into our tents, said goodnight, and listened to the wind blow. You know, sometimes when you're near a mountain, I feel like you can just hear the wind coming for forever. Yeah. Like it just rips down the side of the mountain and then it just travels until finally it hits your tent.
And it's funny because we knew it was supposed to rain at that night, and then our hope of hopes was that it would rain during the night but that it would be dry in the morning, but we didn't really know for sure how that was going to pan out. But I think that we were running in place doing our cardio next to our tents, and then some raindrops maybe fell, and we were like, get in the tents. So we clambered in our tents, and then I wrote in my journal that we actually were in, we were tucked in our beds by 8 p.m. With a 13-mile day the next day. And then I feel like we were kind of nice and settled. And then like Carrie mentioned, we started to hear the wind just start to roar down the mountain, and you'd hear it for several seconds before the tent would kind of start to have the wind hit it. And then it started to rain. So we felt pretty good about being in our tents, pretty darn dry compared to 24 hours before, and just ready for another night in the Mount Rainier backcountry.
Thank you so much for listening to another episode of the
Two Sisters on Adventures podcast.
You can find us on Facebook or Instagram at Two Sisters on Adventures if you want to see any pictures or videos of what we talked about today. And as always, please feel free to leave a rating or review for our podcast. Also, we're on YouTube, so you can see it in video form if you like that. Thanks so much for listening, guys. Bye.